Indie filmmaker and activist Nathalie Rivera came to the festival with one goal: confront Clint Eastwood about his legacy of violence, masculinity, and power. But what started as a confrontation turned into something else entirely: a quiet conversation that blurred the line between villain and icon. The festival was held in a quiet corner of the film world. It wasn't the Oscars, not by a long shot. No glittering red carpets or extravagant gowns, just an old theater downtown, the kind with the vintage marquee and faded posters. The Independent Cinema Festival had earned a reputation for showcasing films that challenged the status quo, the kinds of movies that often didn't make it to the mainstream screens. It was a celebration of authenticity, and for Clint Eastwood, an opportunity to reflect on a lifetime of storytelling that had shaped both Hollywood and the culture at large. Clint was a living legend, but there was something about being surrounded by the youthful buzz of this new generation that made him feel more like a relic than a revered icon. He didn't mind it much. He'd spent years earning his place in the annals of cinematic history, grinding through the late nights, the script revisions, the long takes and grueling conditions. He'd come to realize that it wasn't so much the recognition that mattered anymore, but the legacy he was leaving behind, the stories he had told, and the quiet dignity with which he had lived his life. He'd never been one to bow to trends, not when he was young, not now either. The panel was taking place in a dimly lit, modest theater room. No flashy lights or stage cameras, just the faint echo of a projector hum and the rustle of program flyers on the floor. Clint sat in a worn leather chair, his eyes scanning the faces around him, most of whom were younger than his grandchildren. He was flanked by a handful of filmmakers, activists, and critics, a mix of the old and the new guard. Some had clearly come to see Clint, others to challenge him. The moderator, a sharp young woman named Nathalie, introduced the panel with enthusiasm. "We're here to talk about Clint Eastwood's incredible body of work, from Unforgiven to Gran Torino, and everything in between. But we're also here to dig deeper, to ask how his films stand up in today's world, where ideas of masculinity, race, and justice are being redefined. To that end, we've invited voices from both sides of the conversation. Let's dive in." Clint nodded politely as she handed the mic to the first panelist, a young film critic named Leo. Leo was dressed in a tight t-shirt that proclaimed, "Cinema is revolution." He looked out at the audience as though he were about to drop some truth bombs, adjusting his oversized glasses as he spoke. "Clint's films are an undeniable part of the American mythos," Leo said, his voice brimming with youthful confidence. "But they also play into some very problematic ideas. For example, his portrayal of masculinity, especially in Gran Torino, feeds into this idea that the grizzled old man, who has lived through hardship, is somehow superior to the younger, woke generation. It's as if Clint is telling us that the world needs to be saved by an old white man with a gun, instead of a diverse, inclusive society." That sounded like a bold statement. Let's see how Clint responded. Clint shifted in his seat, his face expressionless. He'd heard it all before. The criticisms were familiar, predictable even. He wasn't bothered by them, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the real confrontation came. Nathalie nodded, looking to Clint for his response. "Clint, your films have always been rooted in a kind of old-school masculinity. How do you reconcile that with the shifting landscape of social justice today?" Clint took a slow, deliberate breath. He didn't rush to answer. He never did. He had learned long ago that the best responses came from patience, from considering every word before it left his mouth. "Well," Clint began, his voice gravelly but steady, "I'm not trying to say that the world's problems can be solved by an old man with a gun. What I've always tried to show is that people are complicated. Life is complicated. If I've made movies that make some folks uncomfortable, that's not an accident. It's because real life isn't always comfortable. I've made films about men who struggle with who they are and what their responsibilities are, and that's not a crime. Before Nathalie could move on, a voice interrupted from the other side of the room. "You can't just keep using that excuse," came a sharp, biting tone. "It's complicated, isn't enough anymore." The voice belonged to Sarah, a passionate young activist who had been sitting in the back row, but now stood up to make her point. She was dressed in a black hoodie with a pin that read, "We stand for equality," and had a tattoo of a peace symbol on her arm. Her hair was dyed a bright shade of pink, and her eyes burned with a fierce energy that reminded Clint of the young activists who had protested against the Vietnam War during his own youth. But Sarah was different. She was angry in a way that seemed too personal, too much about identity rather than understanding. Sarah stepped forward, her expression almost defiant as she addressed Clint directly. "Your films, Clint, haven't just made people uncomfortable. They've reinforced a culture of toxic masculinity. Gran Torino isn't some deep exploration of a man's soul. It's about a guy who believes the only way to fix the world is with his fists. It's a myth we need to deconstruct, not celebrate." Clint's gaze never wavered. His eyes narrowed, but only slightly, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't the kind of smile someone wears when they're mocking. It was the kind of smile reserved for someone who had seen this kind of conflict unfold many times before and knew that it would pass, just as it always did. "You don't know me," Clint replied, his tone steady but firm. "You don't know my experiences or the world I grew up in. What you see in my films is just a reflection of what's out there, not some endorsement of it." Sarah scoffed. "You're part of the problem. You've spent decades glorifying these characters who are stuck in the past, characters who refuse to evolve, to learn from the mistakes of the past. You're like the last gasp of a dying breed, and it's about time we moved on." Her words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. It wasn't just about the films anymore. It was about Clint himself, his legacy, and the values he had come to represent. It was a challenge, not just to him, but to everything he had spent a lifetime building. The room was silent for a moment. Clint could feel the eyes of the younger filmmakers, critics, and activists on him. Some looked uneasy, caught in the middle. Others seemed to agree with Sarah, their faces nodding subtly in support. Clint had lived through the cultural shifts of the 60s, the political upheaval of the 70s, and the economic chaos of the 80s. He had seen the way society's values shifted, but he'd always believed in one thing, that a man's strength lay in his ability to remain grounded in what was true, not what was popular. He had always believed in speaking from the heart, even if it meant challenging the prevailing winds. "You talk about evolving," Clint said slowly, his voice gaining strength. "But evolution doesn't always mean throwing everything you've learned out the window. Sometimes it's about learning to live with what you know, taking responsibility for it, and finding a way to make it work in the world as it is. That's what my characters have always done." Nathalie quickly interjected, sensing the building tension. Okay, let's pause here for a moment. This is exactly the kind of debate we want to have. We're exploring different perspectives, and we want to hear more from both sides." Clint glanced at Sarah, who hadn't taken her eyes off him. He knew this wasn't going to be resolved quickly. He also knew that sometimes, in moments like these, the best thing to do was simply stand firm, hold the line, and wait for the rest of the world to catch up. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. Sarah's words had stung, but they hadn't fazed him. He'd been through worse. But he also knew that this wasn't about films anymore. It was about something deeper, something far more personal. As the discussion continued, Clint's mind wandered briefly to the past. to the countless hours he'd spent in front of the camera, the painstaking choices he'd made, the stories he'd chosen to tell. He wasn't just defending his films, he was defending something more, a way of life that, to him, represented the best of what America had to offer. A life built on grit, responsibility, and an unshakable belief that men and women could find their own path, no matter what the world said. The storm was coming, and Clint Eastwood wasn't going to back down. The panel discussion rumbled on, but it was clear that Clint and Sarah had already locked horns. The audience, both captivated and uneasy, was watching closely, waiting for the next move. Clint didn't mind the spotlight. What bothered him was that Sarah didn't understand. She didn't understand how hard it had been to build what he had built, or the price he had paid for his own evolution. But in the end, he had one advantage. Clint Eastwood had never needed anyone's approval to stand tall. And if this young activist thought he was going to apologize for his life's work, she had another thing coming. As the panel discussion wore on, Clint felt the tension thickening in the air. It wasn't just between him and Sarah. It was the palpable feeling of two different worlds colliding. The youthful idealism of the new wave of filmmakers, critics, and activists, all eager to change the narrative, clashed against Clint's grounded, lived-in wisdom that came from decades of experience, of hard-won lessons learned on both sides of the camera. Clint was used to this kind of ideological pushback. He had seen it before, whether from the rise of the counterculture movement in the 60s or the new political correctness of the 2010s. This wasn't the first time his views had been challenged, nor would it be the last. What kept him grounded, however, was his belief that real change didn't come from erasing the past, but from understanding it, confronting it, and learning from it. But Sarah, and others like her, weren't interested in that. They weren't about learning from the past. They were about rewriting it. The way they spoke, with all their fire and passion, made it clear they felt the old guard's time was over. And Clint wasn't sure if he was ready to give up his place just yet. "Clint," the moderator Nathalie began, trying to bring the discussion back into focus, "we've spent a lot of time talking about your films, but let's get into the real heart of this. How do you see your legacy, particularly in relation to these changing social dynamics? What role do you think your films play in shaping or even reinforcing the cultural landscape of today?" That was a question Clint had asked himself countless times. But today, it felt different, more pointed, as though everyone in the room was waiting for an answer that would either justify his place in history or cement his irrelevance. Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the room. "My legacy," he repeated, his voice low and steady. "It's not something I spend much time thinking about, but if I had to put it into words, I'd say it's about stories. Stories that show the complexity of life, of people. You can't just paint everything in black and white and expect the world to learn something. Sometimes the lesson is in the gray area, the space where things aren't so clear, where decisions aren't easy. But aren't you just using that as an excuse?" Leo, the young critic from earlier, interjected, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Your characters are often these lone wolves, men who go off and solve their own problems with violence. They're not exactly nuanced portrayals of humanity. They reinforce this idea that the answer to everything is toughen up and don't show weakness. That's the message a lot of people walk away with when they watch your films, and it's a dangerous one." Clint's gaze hardened for a moment. He knew exactly what Leo was getting at, but the accusation felt off, almost like it was missing the point. These characters weren't meant to be role models, he thought. They were flawed, deeply human figures who made hard choices, often with devastating consequences. If there was any lesson to be learned, it was that living a life of violence, of bitterness, wasn't something to aspire to. It was a warning, not a celebration. "That's your interpretation," Clint said slowly, his tone even. "And you're welcome to it. But I think you're missing the bigger picture. My films, at least the ones I'm most proud of, are about men grappling with their past, with their mistakes. They're not just cold-blooded heroes. They're broken people who, in the end, are just trying to make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense. They're struggling, just like everyone else. And that's something I think people can relate to, no matter what era they live in." That answer seemed to hit home for a moment, at least with a few people in the room. But before Leo could respond, a new voice chimed in. This time, it was one of the filmmakers, a young woman named Emily, who had been sitting quietly up until now. "I get what you're saying, Clint," she started, "but I think you're also missing something important. The world is changing. People are no longer looking for these rugged, individualist heroes. What audiences today want are stories that reflect the world they live in, stories that are more inclusive and honest about the challenges we face. You can't just keep making films about men who don't show weakness and expect them to resonate. We need to see stories about vulnerability, empathy, and the power of community." That statement hung in the air, heavy with implications. Clint knew Emily was speaking from the heart, but he couldn't help but feel that the world she described was one that had lost touch with the very essence of what made people resilient in the first place, their ability to face adversity head-on without flinching. "Vulnerability, empathy, and community are all important," Clint replied, his voice calm but firm. "But they don't mean anything if you don't first have the strength to protect what you care about. Strength isn't just about physical power. It's about the will to do what's necessary, even when it's hard. You can't create a society based on everyone just being nice to each other. Sometimes, real change requires standing up and saying, 'Enough.' Sometimes it means fighting for what's right." Emily frowned. "That's what we're trying to move away from. This idea that everything can be solved with force. There are other ways to bring about change." Clint paused. He could feel the weight of her words. Maybe there was truth in what she was saying. Maybe the world had evolved to a point where the old ways, his ways, no longer had a place in it. But then, maybe not. Maybe there was still something valuable in standing firm, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. "I'm not saying violence is the answer to everything," Clint said after a moment of thought, his voice softening. "But sometimes people need to be reminded that strength and courage aren't just words. They're actions, and you can't just wish for a better world. You have to be willing to fight for it in whatever way you can." The room fell silent. It was clear that Clint's words had struck a chord, but they didn't resolve anything. In fact, they seemed to raise even more questions. Was Clint's worldview outdated? Was it possible for films like his to coexist with the growing demand for more inclusive, empathetic narratives? Nathalie, sensing the conversation was at a crossroads, decided to introduce another layer to the discussion. "Clint, you've talked a lot about what your characters stand for. But what about you personally? How do you reconcile your own personal beliefs with the current climate? Are you still the same Clint Eastwood, or have you had to evolve over time?" Clint took a long pause, his mind working through the question. He had spent decades building a reputation that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Was he still that person? Or had he become something else over time? "Look," Clint said slowly, "I'm still the same guy I've always been. I've always tried to live by a certain code, a code that values personal responsibility, integrity, and the willingness to fight for what you believe in. But I've also learned a lot along the way. Life isn't as simple as it seemed when I was younger. There's more to the world than just my own perspective." The room went quiet for a moment, and Clint could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. Was this his moment of evolution? Maybe, but only time would tell if it was enough to bridge the gap between him and the younger generation sitting across from him, eager for change. One thing was certain: Clint Eastwood wasn't going down without a fight. The world might be changing, but he wasn't about to fade into the background without giving it his all. As the debate continued to unfold, Clint could feel the atmosphere shifting. It was no longer just a conversation. It had become a battleground, one where ideologies clashed and egos were tested. The younger generation, with their unrelenting drive to redefine cinema and society, stood in stark contrast to Clint's own views, forged over a lifetime of experiences. But what surprised Clint most was how deeply invested he had become in this conversation. He had always prided himself on not needing to justify his place in the world, especially when it came to his work. Yet, here he was, defending not just his films, but his worldview. He realized that perhaps this wasn't just about movies. It was about something deeper. It was about a changing world that was moving forward, while he felt like he was being left behind. Clint could hear the soft murmur of voices from the panelists as they debated among themselves. But one voice cut through the noise like a sharp blade: Sarah. "Clint," she said, leaning forward, her eyes locked onto his. "You've said that your films are about strength and resilience. But don't you think that's a little limiting? In today's world, people want more. They want to see vulnerability. They want to see people struggle and grow, not just be these unbreakable, stoic figures who never show any cracks." Clint took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had heard this argument before, but it was hard to ignore the force with which Sarah spoke. It felt like her words were challenging everything he had built his career on. "That's an interesting point," Clint said slowly, the wheels turning in his mind. "But I think you're oversimplifying it. The men in my films, yeah, they're tough, maybe even cold at times. But that doesn't mean they don't have struggles. They're not perfect. They're grappling with their own demons. The difference is they don't wallow in it. They don't use their pain as an excuse to retreat from the world. They face it head on." Sarah didn't back down. "But don't you think that kind of mentality creates a toxic culture? You're glorifying people who refuse to ask for help, who bottle everything inside, only to let it explode when it's too late. Isn't that exactly what's wrong with the way we've been raised to think about masculinity?" Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in concentration. It wasn't that he didn't understand her perspective. He did. The world had changed, and perhaps, in some ways, he had been slow to adapt to that change. But there was a part of him that refused to give in completely. He had seen too much in his lifetime to simply discard the values that had shaped him. "I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about our problems," Clint said. "What I'm saying is that sometimes the best way to deal with your problems is to confront them, to push forward even when it hurts. Life doesn't always give you the luxury of sitting around and waiting for everything to feel right. Sometimes you've just got to move." Nathalie, sensing the increasing tension, tried to steer the conversation in a new direction. "Okay, I think we've reached an impasse here. But let's take a step back. Clint, you've had such a storied career, from acting to directing. Can you talk about what keeps you going? What drives you to keep telling these stories, even as the industry around you changes so dramatically?" Clint leaned back, his mind momentarily drifting to the past. He thought about the early days, about the thrill of making a name for himself in Hollywood, the satisfaction of creating something that resonated with millions. But that was a lifetime ago. "Truth is," Clint began, his voice softer now, "I've never really cared about the fame. I never set out to be a legend. What drives me is the craft, the art of storytelling, and I'll be honest, the challenge of making something real, something people can feel. That's what motivates me, even today. It's never been about awards or accolades. It's about making something that lasts. Sarah's expression softened. She had been the most vocal in her criticism, but now she looked at Clint with a mix of respect and understanding. I think we all understand that. We're all here because we care about the stories we're telling. But don't you think that means evolving with the times? If you're going to continue telling stories, you need to find a way to make them relevant. The world isn't the same as it was when you started, and the people watching your films aren't the same either. Clint considered her words carefully. She wasn't wrong. The world had changed. The kinds of stories that captured the public's imagination had evolved. People wanted more. They wanted depth, nuance, and yes, vulnerability. But the thing that Clint knew deep down was that there was room for both. There was room for the stories of old, the ones that spoke of stoic heroism, and there was room for the new stories, the ones that explored the complexities of the human condition. He wasn't about to give up on the stories he believed in, but that didn't mean he was blind to the importance of the new wave of filmmakers and thinkers. Maybe you're right, Clint said after a long pause. Maybe there's more to storytelling than what I've been giving. I've always said that the best way to understand the world is to live it, to experience it. But maybe it's time to listen a little more. Maybe it's time to look at the world through different eyes. The words hung in the air, and for the first time that day, Clint felt a shift, a slight loosening of the grip he had on the past. He wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, or if he would ever completely embrace the changes that seemed to be coming. But for the first time in a long while, Clint felt something close to hope. At that moment, Leo, the young critic, raised his hand. Clint, if you're willing to evolve and acknowledge that things have changed, how do you see the future of film? What do you think the next generation of filmmakers should focus on? Clint turned to Leo, considering the question carefully. I think the future of film is about embracing the complexity of humanity. We're all flawed, all trying to make sense of a world that's constantly shifting. The stories that resonate are the ones that reflect that truth. But they also need to challenge the audience. They need to push them, make them think. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the young filmmakers and critics. Maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe we can still tell the kinds of stories that I believe in, about strength, resilience, and standing up for what's right. But we can also tell stories that are more inclusive, more empathetic. Stories that show the messiness of life, but also the beauty in it. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of disagreement. It was the silence of reflection. Everyone in the room, Clint included, seemed to be mulling over the possibilities. For the first time that day, Clint felt like he wasn't just a relic of a bygone era. Maybe he was something else, a bridge between two worlds that, despite their differences, still had a lot to offer each other. But there was still one more thing Clint had to say. Look, I don't have all the answers, Clint admitted. I've spent my whole life making films that speak to my own experiences. But maybe, just maybe, there's room for more. More voices, more stories, more perspectives. If we're going to make something that lasts, we've got to find a way to make it all work. What Clint said hits deep, doesn't it? It's not just about the past or the future. It's about honoring our values, standing strong when the world tries to shake us. If you felt that message in your bones, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Let's keep having these important conversations. Together, we can make sure the voice of reason, the voice of legacy, is never drowned out. See you in the next video.